everyone joining us and being here with us this evening. This is our 8th Code Connection session. We do these monthly. So thank you for taking your time to spend it with us this evening. We do record these sessions and they are available on our website. So if you've missed any of our previous sessions, I do encourage you to go visit our webpage at the city's website, greenvillesc.gov. You can go just put in development code and it'll take you directly to our webpage specific for this project. And you can go and learn all about what our other Code Connection sessions have talked about leading up to tonight's presentation. If you didn't see last month's, I really encourage you to go back and watch the July recording as we really dove into our code preview document of what we can expect when we see the code later at the end of this year as we move into the beginning of 2023. So thank you so much again for being here. Again, I would encourage you to go and look at our other Code Connection sessions leading up to tonight's session, which is very exciting as we start to talk about districts and what districts may look like here in the future, and how those districts will be designed. So I really want to encourage y'all to really dive into this tonight, look at it, and then let us know what you think. You can reach us at planning@greenvillesc.gov. So if you have any questions or comments based on tonight's presentation, please don't be a stranger and please feel free to reach out to us. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our team so that we can get our session started. I have with us this evening Christy Dodson, Thomas Eddington, and Larry Weston, and Charles Buki, all from our consulting team. And I believe that Larry, Christy, and Thomas will be leading our presentation this evening. So thank you all for being here once again and helping us with this important outreach component of our project. As a reminder to everyone who's joining in tonight, we will be taking questions at the end. If you'll go through the question and answer portion of the presentation, we will monitor that throughout. And I would ask, as I do through each of these sessions, that we keep our questions specific to the topics at hand this evening so that our questions are beneficial for the entire group. And relate to the topic at hand. If you have any other questions related to this project or any other planning project, please feel free to always reach out to our planning staff. We're happy to sit down with you one-on-one and have conversations related to this project or any other project in the city. So having said that, that's what we'll be looking for as we move into our question and answer tonight. And Thomas, I'm going to let you take it away from here and get us started.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. And thanks again to everybody who joined tonight and who has joined us in the past. We're excited to share with you what we have started to uncover in terms of land uses, districts and uses that kind of start to create the bedrock, the foundation of a zoning code. And so tonight we'll really kind of start to get into the weeds a little bit with regard to maybe area and bulk standards, some heights, dimensions, things of that sort for early district thinking. And so tonight you'll be hearing a lot from Christy, who is an expert in all things zoning. But as we launch into that, I'll probably give you guys a little bit of a catch up and background as we always do on these code connections. If you go to the next slide, Chris, you'll see that where we are with regard to the schedule is that we have done a couple of things. We've gotten through a lot of our area, some of the early area development plan work for the 5 code areas that we wanted to study that are representative of different districts throughout the community. And so that draft work is done. We're working with the planning staff to kind of go through and finalize that, and we'll plan to present that at the next Code Connection, is my understanding. So in second Wednesday of September. We're also discussing districts and uses tonight, where we are with regard to that first component of 3 as we get into the code. The second and third component are development and design standards, and then the administration review. So those are kind of our 3 big chunks that we'll be working through over the course of this fall, and then deliver that in early December. And so we're right on track with regard to where we want to be. And so hopefully get to public hearings and adoption in December, in the early part of 2023. So everything is on schedule as initially planned. You can go to the next slide, Chris. As we look at districts and uses tonight, we do start to get into some of the more detailed components of zoning regulations, but we wanted to make sure that everybody understood how we start to look at these things, how we start to look at the map that is Greenville, how we start to look at the land uses in Greenville, how we start to look at what's actually on the ground. And, there's a number of ways that we do that. Certainly, you guys have had a lot of really quality planning work done over the course of the past, decade plus, actually. And so, it's important for us to look back at those plans and look at what those recommendations in those plans called for in terms of land use and neighborhood character and or growth node character, whatever that is. We really have taken the opportunity to look back at that planning work. We don't want that to have gone to waste. All of that work gets incorporated into our thinking for zoning districts and content for the zoning ordinance. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, we've done those 5 character development plans. That really helped us frame our understanding with regard to the details for specific kinds of uses down the line. Again, commercial growth node area versus a neighborhood preservation area versus a kind of suburban corridor district. So we're looking at all of that. In addition, of course, we look at geographic information systems, mapping, GIS, urban footprint analyses. We do aerial review, windshield assessments. When we're in town, we do a lot of photographing. We do a lot of walking around. And then, certainly what we try to look at are what are the existing building patterns, what's that built environment, the characteristics, et cetera. And so all of that has gone into our early review of the community, and that will certainly frame how districts and uses get mapped later on, and how that creates the land use designations that you'll see in the final zoning map in December. So we just wanted to make sure that you all understood what goes into that. You can go to the next slide. As we have noted in GVL 2040, the comprehensive plan, as we have noted in Code Connections to date, one of the fundamental changes that we are looking at with regard to this rewrite is certainly moving the code from more of a suburban model to an urban model code. Part of that is because your plans to date have all called for that. GVL 2040 again called for that, and also to create the right space to create quality spaces for the growth that is anticipated, that is occurring and anticipated. Understanding how to put that development in more of an urban pattern will be important. And so that'll be a notable change in the new development code. And so I'll start to turn this over to Christy in just a second, but you'll see in tonight's presentation how some of those districts are starting to tighten up and take on a more urban characteristic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as the evening goes on. Next slide. I think at this point I am turning it over to Christy, and she will go through some of the districts and uses framework that we have to date.
Thanks,
Christy?
Thomas. Yeah, thanks. And I just want to underscore some of those ideas that Thomas just talked about. As Greenville looks to the future and, all the planning that has been done to date, these really incredible small area plans, Greenville 2040, there's this vision in there of Greenville being this walkable place that is reflective of the existing character that makes Greenville special. And what we realized is your old code, and when we say suburban, part of that is a built pattern, right? A little bit further apart, more sprawling. When you think of suburban pattern, it feels different than what you would call a walkable or more urban pattern. And also what's inherent in that is the types of land that you're developing on. So when you think about Greenville, there aren't that many places left that are just big, large parcels out on the edge of town in what we call greenfields. And what your code today is for is really for greenfield development. And really that's more of the development that's happening in the county now. As Greenville's grown and sort of filled out, you need more of a code. And often when we talk about districts, we talk about them like tools or flavors, almost like paint colors that you're using to sort of paint in this picture of the future of Greenville. You need tools that are better suited for infill development, which is really the type of development that Greenville has now. It's sort of a parcel by parcel, a lot here, a lot there. That's the type of development that's going to happen in the future of Greenville. And so we want to make sure that you have tools in your code that reflects that more walkable pattern, and that allows development to happen on that sort of parcel by parcel basis. So that's what, when we studied a lot of these plans, and when we tried to understand sort of how your existing code is misaligned with that, that's one of the big takeaways. You're moving from a more suburban Greenville type of development to a type of development that is more infill, that's more walkable, and that's what we mean by more urban. So what is that starting to look like? We'll dive into that a little bit on some of these next slides. So we talked about in one of the previous Code Connects this idea of a hybrid code. And what that means is, you often hear sort of types of codes as described as a use-based, that's sometimes called Euclidean zoning. And really what that says is commercial is in this zone, residential is in this zone, industrial is over here, and those uses don't really interact much. They're pretty broad umbrellas, and it's quite divided, so there aren't a lot of mix of uses. And that's one of the key ideas that makes a place walkable or more traditional development pattern. You think about downtown, it's a mix of uses. You have some commercial, you have some residential, and sometimes those exist within the same building. So that's one of the key things that we want to reincorporate in your new code, is making sure that we have that mix of uses that's allowed. So it's moving from that suburban idea to that more urban idea. That doesn't mean that uses won't be controlled. Of course, we'll be controlling for uses, but it's allowing for some more flexibility in ways that your existing code doesn't have. The new code will also be a performance code, and what we mean by that are things like, parking standards are often referred to as performance-based because it's a ratio of how many units you're providing or how much square footage of commercial space you're providing. So we'll still have those standards. We still want to be able to control for those externalities, and create predictable outcomes. So there will be performance components of this, and primarily sort of the lens that we're starting with in this code is going to be a form-based code, and that's part of what we're going to be talking through today, is understanding these sort of categories of districts and how we're going to be describing them as sort of under the broad umbrella of what does that form look like? How does that building sit on the site? What does its height and massing look like? What is its activation, doors, windows, sort of, as you walk by it as a pedestrian, how does that feel? And so that's sort of the lens that we're using as a starting point. And then of course the performance components and the use components will be supportive of that form. So that's the sort of lens that we want to think through for the new development code. So I want to make sure that we're talking at the right level and everyone understands sort of where we are now and where we're going. So this is an example from a different community, and this is an example of a mixed use district. And this is what you will find on a district page. So this is more in detail than where we are now, but I want to make sure that everyone's aware that we are getting to this point. So the things that we're talking about today, we'll talk a little bit about lot size, we'll talk a little bit about width, some height and some use. But it's going to be a bit higher level than what these pages are at. And that's so that we can all understand sort of the intent behind these districts and the different flavors that exist within the district categories. And we'll be getting to the detail of these pages. So as we go through this evening and understand what the district categories are, and then the districts that exist within those categories, understand that each one of those categories eventually will arrive at a page like this. And this page gets into a lot of detail about things like minimum lot size, lot width, how much a building can cover on that lot, what the setbacks have to be, the height limitations, and then things like activation. And it's in a quite distinct level of detail for each one of the districts. So just know that while we won't be going in this much detail today, that we're getting there. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that what we talk about today is sort of the final version of the districts. We're at a fairly high level at this point, and wanting to make sure that we're all describing things in an intent level before we get into the really minutia detail that we all think of as the fun zoning piece. Next slide, please. Also, as an accompanying piece of the district pages, we have what we call our rules of interpretation. So, the previous slide were pretty detailed images and metrics as far as what the requirements are for each of the zoning districts. And part of what accompanies that is some of this text that's a rule of interpretation. And the idea of this is that it gives everybody the same understanding of what we mean when we say setback. What is a setback? What's the intent? How is it measured? Where is it even applied? So all of these questions are what's answered in this rules of interpretation. So they're really accompanying documents, and they'll all be, of course, included within the zoning code together. So after you have all the district pages and they describe all the metrics and in those 4 columns that we just looked at, immediately following that will be these rules of interpretation. And the idea is that it really supports so that everybody knows exactly how those metrics, what we mean by those metrics, what we're trying to achieve by those metrics. And by achieve, I mean things like supporting walkability, giving a more pedestrian-friendly environment, making a safe environment for those arriving in vehicles and on foot and on bike. So there's an understanding of why we're doing the things we're doing, and also how we're measuring those and what the requirements are. So those are the 2 accompanying pieces that we'll be looking at in future Code Connects on down the road. But right now we are sort of one step higher level than that. So wanted to give everybody a bit of a preview of where we're going, even though we won't get into this much detail today. Just know that more detail is coming down the line. So work in progress, where are we now? What is it we want to talk about? So part of what we're going to talk about today, and yeah, you can go ahead and flip to the next slide. That's perfect. We are going to go through each of what we call district categories. And so what you'll see is we're going to talk through sort of each category or umbrella of districts. And you'll notice that there are sort of subcategories within those districts. So we have this one, for example, is house scale. So this is what maybe today, so you can equate it to something you're familiar with in your existing code, would be your single family districts. And so that's sort of the umbrella category of what that district is intended to do, or what that district category is intended to do. And you have different districts underneath that category. So for example, today, you don't only have one single family residential district, you have 2, you have R6 and R9. And so what that would translate to in the new code is what we're calling house scale districts. And then there are 4 different districts under that umbrella. And so what I want to go through today, and we'll go through each of these in detail, are the overall categories, so you can understand the sort of types of districts that we're anticipating having, and then the districts that fall underneath those categories and sort of the difference between those. So that way, hopefully everybody will have a takeaway of what's the intent, why do we even have this category, what is it trying to do, and then what are the different flavors that exist within that? Because we know that in our single family areas today, that not all single family looks the same. Not all mixed use looks the same. It's different intensities, they're different flavors, and they feel different based on different contexts through Greenville. So that's what we're in the process of doing right now. We have our district categories, our sort of overall umbrellas of districts that we think match all the places and the types of the development patterns you have in Greenville and the development patterns you would like to have in Greenville. And then we're making sure that all the districts and all of your tools that you have, we think of districts as tools to apply your plans and to implement your plans. So we want to make sure that all the districts you have, all the tools in your toolbox are the ones that you need to actually implement those plans. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'll go through each one of these, and Larry and Thomas, feel free to jump in and add anything that I may have missed. It may also spice it up a little bit, in case I get too deep on some of these metrics and send everybody to sleep. So that is not the goal.
We'll help out.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is house scale, and I've already described what that is. That is essentially what your single family districts are today. And each one of these has an intent statement, and it really describes, what it is we're thinking about for the character of these types of districts. So in your house scale, we're imagining these as your neighborhood environments, and they accommodate low intensity housing options. And so that's single family homes and accessory dwelling units. And these are all supporting and in general within walking distance of neighborhood serving retail, food services, some service uses. So, they're adjacent to your corridors, and And these are really a translation of some of your single family districts. And we're also giving you a couple more new tools that will help right size some of the existing patterns you have and maybe give you some more tools for the future. And so in general, when we look at the districts underneath that, so we have RHA, RHB, RHC, and RHD. And what that stands for is residential house A, residential house B, and so on. In general, the first one is always going to be the lowest density. And as we go through the districts through to D, or in some instances, there will be numbers instead of A, B, C, and D, that they get more intense as you go across the line. And so to give you a little bit of an idea of why you need these different tools, so you'll see a couple just high level descriptions that talk about what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve and what are some of the metrics we're using to achieve that. So for RHA, you look at that lot size, it's something like an 80-foot wide lot size. And all of these have a very similar height requirement or a height maximum because, a lot of your residential neighborhoods are of that height range. So really this house scale districts, they vary based on lot size and lot width. And that's because as you go from 80-foot wide lots to 60-foot wide lots to 40, and maybe even down to a 25, you can think of there are different neighborhoods in Greenville that sort of fit those different characteristics. You have some areas that are more sort of estate lots that are quite wide and they have pretty deep setbacks. The building isn't particularly close to the neighbor. And then you have a spectrum. As the lots get a little bit smaller, the setbacks also get a lot smaller and the homes tend to get a little bit closer together. So the idea is that, we're expanding from your 2 districts today into 4 districts. So you get a few more tools to help address each end of that spectrum. So you get a tool for some of the bigger lots and you get a tool for some of the smaller lots. And in the middle are sort of the tools that you have today. So that's really the intent behind the house scale districts. Anything you want to add, Thomas or Larry?
No, I think you covered
No,
that well. And I
I
think
just
that
got
I know
ready.
you guys are really looking at neighborhoods in detail. And so as we move through this process between now and December, we'll start to get an idea of where these are most applicable, if applicable. But it's a solid, this is the starting point, right?
Yeah. And I will add to this, something we're thinking about and why we felt like you needed a few more tools in Greenville is addressing some of those issues that we're coming up with the infill ordinance and trying to make sure that when new development does occur that we have the tools in place that can help right size it and it feels compatible with what's existing in the neighborhood. So that's part of the intent of giving a few more tools is you have a few more flavors that you can apply in places that would be more right sized for the character of the neighborhood. Let's jump to the next one. So this is another residential district. We're calling this neighborhood scale, and this really is still low intensity. So it is still house scale. We're calling it neighborhood scale though because it is slightly more intense than your single family districts, and it includes things like single family homes, but it also allows for things like duplexes, triplexes. Some include fourplexes or townhomes or small apartments. And these are all within walking distance and support your neighborhood retail. They support your neighborhood restaurants. And there's another sort of spin on this. So the districts that are that have an X in them, so RNX, you see an RNXB and RNXC. So these actually allow for neighborhood serving commercial uses that are very limited in scale and extent, but they're still within that envelope. So the building form still looks like that house scale building. And we felt like you needed a district like that because you have some areas and things that come to mind are things like the Pettigrew Historic District, Mills Ave, or even Stone Ave, where you have businesses that are in historic homes. And so it's trying to get at that form. We want it to feel like a house, look like a house, but it has some additional use flexibility in it for maybe things like professional offices or a little salon, something like that. So when you see that RNX district, that would allow for some of those very limited small scale commercial uses. And so to give you kind of an idea of the spectrum of what we're thinking about for this, we have what we're calling RNA. So that again is our sort of lowest intensity of the neighborhood scale type district. And that would allow up to a fourplex. And the intent behind this is that it it looks and feels like a house. So this is truly a house scale district. It could be a duplex, it could be up to a fourplex, but the metrics that we're thinking about for that are very similar in size and scale to what the single family districts are. It just allows for some more housing options within that same envelope. Moving up the scale a little bit, RNB would allow for up to 8 units. This is where we're thinking about introducing some affordability bonus. So as you know, in the state of South Carolina, we're a little bit limited in how we can provide affordable housing, so we have to do that through incentives rather than a requirement. And so being able to give a little bit more allowances for additional units is part of how we're thinking about getting there in these districts. So for example, in RMB, you could have up to 8, maybe up to 10 with a bonus. We're still, right sizing to make sure we have the right metrics for what that bonus and that level of affordability needs to be. But both RMB and RNXB, their metrics and the size of what that building can be, it still feels house scale. It's just a little bit deeper of a building. And RMB and RNXB, they would look essentially the same from the street. The only difference between the two is that RNX district would allow for some of those commercial uses. So the idea is that if it's an RN district and it's RMB or RNXB, it's not necessarily going to look different from an outcome. It's just a matter of what uses you can have within the building's walls. And then moving up the scale just slightly to RNC and RNXC, that's where you get to a slightly taller building. So, the idea is that this could be a full 3-story building, whereas the previous ones are more 2.5. It's sort of that house scale. You can get a little bit wider of a building. So it really is that sort of small apartment or townhouse scale building. And so it's less house sized and more sort of that medium to small apartment size building. And very similar, the RN district, the RN would just allow for residential, and then if it has an X, you get that commercial flexibility. Anything to add to that? Nope.
No.
Okay, great. All right, so let's keep going on residential. Community scale. So community scale is really intended to accommodate that medium intensity housing. So think a condo or an apartment development. So this really is jumping up the scale spectrum. You have our sort of single family, our house scale districts. We have the neighborhood districts that are a bit of that transition, and then our community scale districts that really would be located on our nodes and corridors, right? This is getting to a level of intensity that isn't necessarily found within the neighborhoods currently, and are going to be more focused on those nodes and corridors. And so, they could include things like duplex, triplex, fourplex, townhouses, but they could also accommodate things up to the larger apartment or condo complexes. And they're going to support, again, that neighborhood serving retail and food services. Something to note about this community scale is that there would be some allowance for very limited commercial uses. So think something like a coffee shop or a daycare, something that is quite small, not that parking intense, that would be truly neighborhood serving. Even something like the leasing office for these apartment or condo buildings could be considered that sort of limited commercial use. And it feels like a much a bit wider of a building than what you would get in the neighborhood districts. So, these are going to start at the low end at 2 stories and would be allowed up to 5. And you'll notice that the designations here, once we're in community scale, have actually changed. So we're a residential community, and instead of being A, B, and C, and so on, we're actually 2, 3, and 5. And that's an indicator of height. So once we get into these larger scale districts, you'll notice this in the mixed use districts as well that we'll be talking about next, that's an indicator of height. So whenever we have these districts, and really that's the primary difference between a lot of these districts. So in RC2, you're allowed 2 stories at a base, and then 3 and 5 and so on. In these particular districts, instead of providing additional dwelling units, we are saying that you could have a bonus in height. So it's functionally the same, right? So additional height, because this is an apartment district, would then result in additional dwelling units. And so because we're controlling more in this category, we're thinking about the bulk and the mass and the height of it more. That's what we want to base that affordable bonus on, rather than the number of dwelling units that exist within the building. So these community scale districts, for example, RC2, could have 2 stories, and then once you provided that affordable housing, whatever that requirement is, then you could get up to 3 stories. And you'll notice that the last line on there is building width. And those are sort of maximum building widths. We want to make sure that it's an engaging pedestrian environment as you walk down the street. And you'll notice these building widths are quite a bit larger than the ones that we've looked at in the previous districts. And that really is to reflect that these are those buildings that are just the next step up in scale and in intensity.
And Christy, along that line, so yeah, even in the prior couple of slides for neighborhood and house scale districts, the bottom line is maximum building width allowed, right? And the
That's
top
right.
line for lot width is a minimum allowance. So that's a minimum allowance for a lot. And a lot, of course, can be larger than what is noted in that top row, if you will, right? And then on that bottom row, that's a maximum building width, the actual physical structure, right? Beyond that, you'd have to have a break in the building, etc., right?
Yeah, and that could be something like a courtyard. It could be, a whole separate building. So, part of that rules of interpretation that I talked about early on, we'll talk about what we mean by building width, how that's measured. Once you get to that maximum, what do you need to do to not exceed that? And what are some of the options that you have? So, yeah, that's good context, Thomas. Any other thoughts before I move on?
Yeah, it might be a good time to pause for a second and just make sure that everybody is still with us on this. The last 3 slides have been pretty intense, and we've gotten into a number of different numbers and definitions that folks may not have heard before. It might be good just to see if the folks are still with us, if there are any questions at this point that we can answer before we go on, because we've got several more slides that are going to be intense, just as these first 3 have been.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Larry, let me go ahead and bring up a couple of the questions that we received in the chat. And I think one of them, and Sherry, please let me know if we did not answer your question. But Sherry had asked about the lot widths in the house scale chart. And then
Mhm.
she came back and said, thank you, Thomas, for clarifying.
Mhm.
Thank you, Thomas, for clarifying minimum max dimensions in the charts. So let us know if we didn't answer that question, and we'll come back to it, Sherry. Then Lois asked, how can you have a building width wider than the lot width?
Right.
So,
Same,
Yeah,
same
yeah, it's a good.
question.
It
yes,
is.
I want to make sure that we're getting those questions answered.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we'll just pause right here. I've got a little bit of ahead of the metrics and should have clarified that, some of these are maximums, some of them are minimums, and it really is just meant to be a summary. We get into exactly what those maximum and minimums are when we dig into the district pages, which is sort of the next phase of the project. But just to clarify, the dwelling units that we're showing here, the number of dwelling units, that is a maximum number of dwelling units. The lot width is a minimum lot width, so that is sort of the width as you're walking down the street between property lines. And another thing to note here too is these are actually the minimum widths, assuming that you're providing vehicular access from the rear of the property. So if you have a driveway that is coming in from the front of your property, that minimum width actually is a little bit wider. It's going to be slightly wider because we need to be able to accommodate a building at a reasonable size and a driveway. And something like a 25 or a 15 minimum lot width is really just too narrow to do that. So this would be the minimum lot width if you had an alley, or if you built an alley, or if you were on a corner street. So those lot widths will be slightly wider if you have front vehicular access. So those are minimums. The next one, which is height in both stories and feet. And I should explain that we like to do height in both stories and feet because it helps sort of right size those stories. It makes sure that the stories aren't too small. So we want to make sure that they feel like good and livable spaces. And so we set a stories maximum, and we also set a height maximum. Because if you just set a story maximum, those stories could be very tall stories, and it may not result in very predictable heights. And so we really want to be able to provide both a stories maximum and a feet in height maximum. So those are height maximums. Um, Building widths are also maximums. So I think it's a great question of how can you have a building wider than the lot? It's just the lot minimum width. So, you may have let's take RNA for example, just because it's the first one here. So you may actually have a 60-foot wide lot. And so that means that, once you take into account setbacks and where you can sort of place the building, you could get to a building that is quite wide, 40 feet being the max. And so it's part of making sure that even if you have a really wide lot, that we want to make sure that the building that exists within that lot is still right sized and scaled appropriately to reflect a lot of the character of that existing area or what that community wants to be. So that's why we set a building width maximum. And also, as I mentioned, once we jump up a level in scale to the community scale and mixed use, we set those maximums because we want to make sure that there's sort of a change in facade as you walk down the street. So, a block could be upwards of 600 feet, and we just want to make sure that it's not one big, long, continuous face of a building, but that it has a little bit of change in planes back and forth. It doesn't have to be a lot. You think of traditional buildings, they tend to be pretty consistent, but we want to make sure that every once in a while there is a break in the mass of that building to sort of add to the interest as someone walks down the sidewalk. So those are great questions. And
Thanks, Christy. And then we have some others, but I want to make sure we get through our presentation. But there is one that I can answer really quick. Will this be recorded for later viewing? Yes, Laura, we are recording it. It will be on our website in a couple of days. And then Tina asked about what affordable benefits are there for developers of single family type up to quadplex in that first district under neighborhood scale?
Let's see, specifically for the RNA district. So right now, because that is a house scale district, we are just saying that it is a 4-unit max district. So we didn't really explore any additional units because it could change the scale of that district. We wanted it to sort of look and feel and have very similar characteristics to a single family house. And so we started the affordable bonus at the next scale up. And it's also a bit of a housing economics question. So more often than not, you have to, for every 10 units you provide, one of those can be affordable. That's how the housing economics work. So it really wasn't until we got to RNB that affordable housing made sense from a market perspective. That of course doesn't take into account things like public subsidy. But if you're just a for-profit developer and you're building housing, really it's hard to make the pro forma work until you're able to provide up to 10 units. So that's really why we started it at that next scale.
Thanks, Christy. We'll come back to other questions at the end so we can make sure we get through the material.
Great. All right, we will keep rolling. And the next couple districts are actually quite similar, so it should be fairly straightforward to go through, particularly now that I've given a little bit of context for what the height designations are. So this should look familiar. We have a 2, 3, 5. So those are indicators of 2 stories, 3 stories, 5 stories. We do have a bit of a different one, so throwing everybody a curveball here. So these are our mixed use districts, and mixed use is intended to do exactly what it names. So it's accommodating residential, retail, service, commercial uses in environments that are vibrant, they're pedestrian friendly. And then we're adding on to that an MXD, which is mixed use downtown, because we know that downtown Greenville is a special place and we want to be able to give it a district that treats it as such. And so the downtown mixed use is really intended to accommodate the most intense, the mixed use, the most pedestrian friendly. So it has the most requirements that really bolster that pedestrian friendly environment, those good urban form metrics that we have. We want to make sure that those are really clearly delineated for that downtown district. And in this district, in these districts, there are 4 separate districts. The buildings can be exclusively residential or not residential. They can be exclusively commercial, exclusively office. But the vertical mix of uses is strongly encouraged. So we're not requiring that each building be a mix of uses. It's simply allowing it, and we're just encouraging that mix of uses to happen. So the key things to note here is that, we do have our sort of base and bonus system is what we're calling it. So we have our base heights, and those are matched up by the number at the end of each of the districts, 2, 3, and 5. And then we have those bonus heights that would be associated with the provision of affordable housing. Mixed use downtown is going to be a little bit different in how we're controlling for height. Because it's downtown, it's special, it needs that extra level of review. So that is likely going to be a little bit more nuanced than sort of the mixed use 2, 3, and 5 districts that are going to exist on your nodes and corridors. And they're mixed use shop front. So this is basically one level slightly more intense, so I'll call it intense. It's not necessarily intense from a height and a massing perspective. But what we mean by shop front is it has different requirements for that ground level as you walk down the street. So for the shopfront districts, and we're sort of calling those mixed use shopfront because the use provisions are very similar. They still accommodate things like residential, retail, service, commercial, and it's in the most pedestrian friendly and vibrant environment. So this really is going to be a good tool for nodes. And what's different about the shopfront districts is that they're on that ground floor. We want to make sure that there are relatively high transparency requirements and that ground floor is required to be slightly taller so that in the future it could be used as a commercial use. We're not saying that these buildings have to be used for commercial use on the ground floor. It's not a requirement, but it's making sure that they're constructed in a way that they can be either retail or commercial ready. And so these really are the key nodes, even just key intersections. Maybe it's not the whole node itself. It's key intersections. One of them that comes to mind, and we of course have provided one for downtown because again, downtown is a special place. We make sure that we treat it as such. Things like Main Street, where you have that really pedestrian focused environment. It's a lot of commercial on the ground floor. You still have residential above. It's sort of your natural mixed use area, but we want to make sure that we treat those areas that are special, that are shop front oriented, and they are pedestrian oriented. We want to give them a little bit more special of a designation. And so that's what the shop front is meant to do. It gives us those additional requirements on the ground floor for a little bit more height and a little bit more transparency so that those could evolve to be retail or commercial uses in the future if that's not what they're originally going to be built for. Go to the next set of districts. So we've kind of gone all the way through our intensity of districts, right? So we started residential, single family, went to neighborhood, community, and then our mixed use districts, and sort of ended with our very prominent nodes and intersections that are shop front. We're going to kind of dial back down a little bit and talk about some business districts and talk about industrial districts and a few special districts. So starting with business, there's actually 2 different flavors of business districts. And these really are districts that are intended to create employment along your corridors. So mixed use is a tool that would be likely used more often at your nodes, maybe in some of your corridors. But we know that in a lot of your corridors, these are really your employment and job centers. And we have these in 2 different types for now. So we have a general business and a business heavy. And these are actually very different in outcome. So just because they're under the business umbrella, that really speaks to more of the use and the intent. The actual form of what results in these 2 districts is quite different. So business general, this is intended for more walkable places that have small lots and more urban building configurations. They're not quite as urban as mixed use. And what I mean by that is under a business general, you would get more like what this diagram is showing, where you have a building and a parking lot next to it. Whereas in mixed use, you really have a building lining the entire street and the parking would have to happen behind. So it's still quite urban. The building is still up to the street. And I think about places like Lawrence Road as you get close to downtown, or Augusta as you get close to downtown. You have these sort of neighborhood serving commercial corridors that are a lot of retrofit, you're trying to make those more pedestrian friendly environments. Those are the places where business general is going to make a lot of sense. When you have these smaller lots, they're pretty shallow, and so you have to kind of configure parking next to the building, but it still is quite urban, it's still quite walkable. So that's the idea for the business general. Business heavy, on the other end, is more for your truly auto-oriented places. So an example of this is the motor mile, where you have a lot of your car sales, even car repair places. Like, we still need those places, right? And we still need a district to be able to accommodate that, but we want to make sure that it happens in the right places. And so that's what your business heavy is. And you can imagine that, of course, that is a very different building outcome. So we're still going to require things like sidewalks. We still want it to be safe for a pedestrian to walk, but it's not going to be an urban environment. We're not going to be making it a place where it's going to be people's favorite walking path. It's going to be safe, but it's not going to be a more urban oriented environment. It's going to be places where those vehicle repair and auto oriented uses can go. So let's switch to industrial. And industrial, very similarly, has two districts that, they fall under the industrial umbrella because they are trying to accommodate these light industrial and makerspace kind of uses, but they're going to result in two very different build patterns, and they're going to exist in different places. So the two of those come in the flavors of industrial flex and industrial general. So industrial flex is really intended to accommodate a variety of light industrial and manufacturing uses, but it still allows for things like retail, service, commercial, and even residential opportunities. I think a good example of this is Poe West. So that's the sort of thing that we're thinking about. And, I'm in Atlanta, and if you've visited, we have things like the Beltline, where you have a lot of these older warehouse uses that are being converted to things like breweries, distilleries, but they're in pretty walkable places. They're embedded in neighborhoods, or they're embedded next to things like the Swamp Rabbit Trail, or our Atlanta version of that is the Beltline. And so you still want to be able to allow some of those maker spaces, that really, really light and sort of maker space, light industrial type use, but you want to be able to do it in a pedestrian friendly way. We want to have that good urban form and that walkable environment. And so that's what industrial flex is intended to do. It really is intended to sort of blend all of that. It could even be a lot of rehab. This is a great example of a old factory that was converted in Cleveland into lofts and sort of some maker spaces on the first floor. So that, and in the Greenville version of that are your sort of mills. So we want to be able to have a district that preserves that sort of artistic flair of those districts, but also allows for a mix of uses. Now, the other end of that spectrum is your industrial general. So we know that in the city of Greenville, you don't have a ton of heavy industrial, things like concrete plants or steel manufacturing, things like that. You have more warehousing, some logistics, some shipping, and that really is what that industrial general. It's what a lot of communities would call, industrial light or even industrial medium. So these are things that are larger footprint commercial buildings. They have lower impact industrial activities, but you don't necessarily want them next to your neighborhoods. So it has some outdoor storage. It could have some shipping. So you're going to have some truck traffic involved. So that's your industrial general category. And those are the two sort of flavors and pretty different outcomes that fall within the industrial umbrella that still support that economic engine and the jobs piece. And then to close out this discussion of all the districts and the flavors that we're thinking about, I do want to bring to everybody's attention a couple special districts that we'll be introducing for things like campuses. So you have some universities, you have some hospitals, and we want to make sure that those have a campus designation, a civic designation for government buildings, and also a park designation, since open space is a key component of the comp plan. So we want to be able to have a designation that gives park a correct zoning category. So those are sort of special districts that we'll be considering. And then I also want to highlight the fact that a lot of your overlays that you have today, those will be preserved. So things like your preservation districts, your neighborhood revitalization districts, your airport overlay, your special flood hazard area, those are all going to remain in place. And that includes, the boards and the processes involved. We are thinking about adding one for downtown design, so we want to make sure that we're preserving that design oversight for the downtown. But the rest of the overlay districts will remain in place, as well as the guidelines associated with those. So I'm impressed everybody hung with me for this long. I'm going to hand it over to Thomas to quickly walk through next steps, and then hopefully we'll have time for a couple questions.
Thanks, Christy. So Christy outlined in detail districts and uses, which is really, again, the first kind of major component of the new development code. So some of our next steps will be continuing to evolve the districts and uses, and then moving into some detailed work with regard to development regulations, subdivision standards, kind of lot and kind of site planning requirements. And then really the third component is code administration and process to refine that within the new development code. So those will really be the two next big steps with regard to code. We do plan to conduct some additional meetings with neighborhood representatives, et cetera, as we get further along in the code to make sure that everybody's following along and that they understand. And then really as we get closer to the release of the code in December, to dig deep into mapping and district designation. And so we'll start really refining that over the course of the starting now, actually, and over the course of the next couple of months. So that's really where we'll be. And we'll convey at the next meeting. We'd like to walk through some of our district character development plan work that we've done with regard to the 5 representative districts. So please join us for that. And beyond that, we'll have some additional code connections that'll kind of give you guys an understanding of where we are as we get further along in development standards and process. And so stick with us and continue to take this ride, because as Shannon likes to say, zoning is fun. And so we're trying to make it as fun as it can be. I think that's all we have, Shannon, unless there are some questions or if there's anything that you would like us to clarify or circle back to.
Yes, thank you. And yes, zoning is fun. It can be fun, and we want it to be fun. That's why we're doing a new code. So, so that maybe it'll be more fun for people in the future. Having said that, I have a question before we jump into the panel, and I know we're about to run out of time, but I think it's really important because I think we kind of glossed over it, and I think it's an area of the code that a lot of people, unless they live in an NRO zone, may not be familiar with. So, Christy, if we could go back to the overlays, and I know this is important because we talked about it with our community development staff just a few weeks ago. But can you talk to us about how the NR, the neighborhood revitalization overlays, would work within the within the new parameters of what y'all are looking at for residential?
Sure. So a lot of our new metrics, as we sort of dive into the next level of what the metrics are going to be and how we're actually going to control for different things, it's going to look a bit different than how you are currently controlling for things. So there may be a little bit, there will be more nuance for controlling for the form and making sure that some of that infill is sort of right sized in the future. But really beyond the what we call the form and massing, so the building width, the depth, the height, and we get in a little bit of architectural territory as far as, we just want to make sure that there's enough windows and doors so that it's a pedestrian friendly environment. That's about as far as we would go in controlling for the sort of architecture of the building. The neighborhood revitalization, it really dives more into those architecture specific and design specific pieces. And it's also a bit similar to some of the preservation items, right? So those are in areas that are more sensitive, that have a strong character, and there's a strong sense of wanting to preserve that character in a way that is more about the architecture of the building. So maybe specific materials that can and can't be used, or how a chimney would need to be oriented, or what a roof slope or gable would need to look like. So those are things that would be sort of beyond the zoning. So we'll have a bit more of what the form, and that's sort of why the form-based code is what we're calling a piece of this. But the neighborhood revitalization overlay would really get to more of those architectural pieces that get into the architectural character of that place.
Thank you. I think that except for the neighborhoods that are currently part of our NRO, that people may not be as familiar with that portion of the code as maybe some of our other portions. And I think making sure that we talk about how that's going to intersect with some of the new residential standards that y'all are putting in place is important, so that everyone knows that there are considerations about that moving forward, and that we are having those dialogues and conversation. So we do have a couple more questions, and I know we've only got 2 minutes, and so I don't know that we'll have time to address them tonight, but I do think this next one is a great question for our future code connection session. And that would be from Sherry, maybe out of the scope for today's meeting, but could you address how conversion to the new districts happens as a process? And so I think we will be getting into that in a future code connection session. So Sherry, we've heard you. Rest assured we will address it, but just wanted to make sure we saw your question. And Thomas or Christy or Larry, do you have anything to add to that before I move to the final question?
Well, the only thing I would add is that we are all our team is looking forward to being back in Greenville in person, answering questions and reaching out. We know we've covered a number of items today that have generated a lot of interest, that are and they were pretty intense items that were being presented. There are lots of questions that are still out there, and we want to be able to meet with residents and others to answer those questions. So we're looking forward to those times over the next couple of months.
Thank you, Larry. And that is a good point. I'm going to interject just for a second, real quick, Thomas and Christy, before you come back to Sherry's question. But this is a lot of information for today, and I know it may be something that some people on our call today want to go back and review again, and then have specific questions. And we encourage that. If y'all have specific questions on this and want to dive into it, just let any of us know. And you can always go to planning@greenvillesc.gov. You can email planning@greenvillesc.gov, and we can make sure that the conversation specific to any of these districts get to Larry and Christy and Thomas. So just wanted to make sure that, because it is a lot of information, Larry. I think that's a very good point. Thanks for saying that, because I do know it's pretty intense to try to take all this in and then thinking about, okay, now how is that going to work for the future? So Thomas and Christy, did you have anything else to add to Sherry's question?
No, I would just say that as we get into the mapping and the districting, we'll certainly address that. And I would also note that as we look at districts converting, really, we've always been strongly committed to preservation of neighborhoods, right? And so we want to make sure that as they get a new designation, we still maintain the existing character. And so our intent is to not create what we call existing non-conforming structures, existing non-conforming lots. And so we'll pay very close attention to that as we lay the mapping, the districting down. And so our hope is that we don't have those issues. The only places where we'll likely see, or the primary places where we'll likely see changes in the growth nodes, the development areas that have been identified in GVL 2040 for change, growth, redevelopment, given that you have very little greenfield land left. And so that's probably where you'll see more change. And again, that would encourage growth, development, change, but not in the neighborhoods.
Thank you. And then the final question that was in, and it's more specific to an area, but I always try to get to each of the questions, and it may be a deeper conversation, because I don't know the answer. But where does the West End Cottage District fit into this multifamily zoning, but evolved over 100 years as single family homes? I don't know that we've gotten that far along, but y'all please jump in if I'm wrong on that.
We're actually not sure. We haven't gotten into that level of study yet, but that is on our list over the course of the next 6 weeks, is to really get into that districting, to begin that study and analysis for specific blocks and districts.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. Well, we are at 6:02. I appreciate everybody. We got through all the questions. So thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. If we didn't get to into enough detail, or you have other questions based on any of the other information tonight, again, please feel free to reach out to us at planning@sc.gov. Please visit our website anytime and watch our Code Connection sessions. We try to put up every month our Code Connection session and a recap of the work that the team has been doing over that past month. And we will be back here in 5 weeks, just based on the calendar. So It'll be 5 weeks till you see us again on the second Wednesday of September, September 14th at 5 p.m. for our next Code Connection session. And with that, I will say good night. Thank you all again, as always, for a great Code Connection session. And we appreciate each member of our community taking your time out to be here tonight with us. Any final words before we sign out?
No, thanks again for joining. We look forward to seeing you next month.
Great.
Same
Thanks
here.
again. Appreciate it. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.